welcome. I'm Bill Brown of Brookings Mountain West on behalf of all my colleagues in UNLV. Welcome to, our 4th year of our lecture series already. Especially thanks for coming out on a night like this. In case you beat the rain in, it is pelting down out there right now. Nobody gets to leave. We're going to close the doors. Again, welcome. We're very excited to have back, almost 1 year to the day, colleague Tracy Gordon from Brookings. Tracy's a fellow in economic studies, at least for a few more days at Brookings before Brookings loses her to, she's going to join the staff of the Council of Economic Advisors. So that's the kind of people don't applaud, we're not all that happy in some ways. But Tracy started this topic sort of a year ago and is going to carry it forward with tonight's lecture. Those of you who heard her know you're in for a treat. The others, I won't spoil it for you. Tracy has her graduate degrees in public policy and economics from Berkeley, undergrad at Stanford, for which we forgive her. Right? And let me say, I always mention this at the end of the lectures, but I remembered this year, we videotaped the lectures, obviously. They're up on our website, but also the PowerPoint will be up there alongside it in a few days. So don't go into spasms trying to copy some of her graphs and charts if you don't need to. And with that, I'll let Tracy take the stage.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be back here today. I hope that's not too loud for everyone. As Bill mentioned, I'm from the West, so I always welcome a chance to get back out here, and especially to get out of Washington and to really find out what's happening in state and local governments, which are my focus right now at Brookings. So I'm going to be talking about Nevada's position in federal funding, and the title actually is borrowed from a colleague at the Kennedy School at Harvard, By Choice or By Chance. So why is Nevada last in federal funding, and what can be done about it? So first I'm going to provide an overview of federal grants, and then I'll talk about where Nevada stands. I'll try to explain why Nevada is in the position that it's in, and then what are some things that can be done about it. And I look forward to an engaging dialogue with you about your thoughts on these issues. So the federal government distributes about 17% of its budget, about $600 billion a year, in grants to state and local governments. And it's done this basically since time immemorial. I was actually lecturing in a political science class earlier today and pointing out that for most of our history, the federal government didn't do a lot. It ran the postal service, it fought wars, it signed treaties, they had some judges, but the federal government didn't really do a lot in terms of service provision until the 20th century. The Great Depression, the launch of social insurance programs like Social Security, and also the military escalation that came with World War I and World War II. But even then, even as the federal government was expanding, it distributed about 9% of its budget during the New Deal to state and local governments, because it recognized state and local governments have certain advantages when it comes to the social safety net or spending on public works programs. So today, as I said, federal spending on grants to states and localities is about $600 billion, or about 1.4% of GDP. Most federal grants are for health and human services, and most of those are for Medicaid. So that would be the light blue, the teal bar up at the top. Mandatory spending means that it's determined by law. If you are eligible for the program, you automatically receive it. It's an open-ended program. Other programs are determined through the budget process each year through the discretionary acts of the Congress. The priorities for the federal government in terms of grants have shifted over time. It used to be that the federal grant really focused on things like community development and transportation. Those sort of social types of, or sort of programs to provide kind of social goods or public goods have been largely displaced by payments to individuals, things like Medicaid and other types of grants, transfers for individuals like welfare that is run through state and county governments. So you can see this kind of transition over time. So why does the federal government do this? Well, the federal government has certain inherent advantages when it comes to raising revenue. In particular, it's more difficult for taxpayers to evade taxation by leaving the jurisdiction. So think about if a city were to try to raise revenues, people could always leave that jurisdiction to avoid paying taxes. Same thing is true at the state level. We hear about that less at the national level, except for there's a paper actually that shows that high-paid soccer players do transcend national borders all the time in Europe in order to evade taxes taxes. And recently, some of you might have heard about the French actor Gérard Depardieu, who left France because of very high marginal tax rates. But those are the exceptions. Usually people don't leave the country that they're from to avoid taxes. That's more of a concern at the state and local level, where mobility is easier. So the federal government has an advantage. They can do the heavy lifting when it comes to taxation. There's also administrative advantages. It's easier for them to do things like have an IRS, and then state and local governments can piggyback off of that effort. But state and local leaders, as many governors and mayors will tell you, have an advantage when it comes to spending. They know their populations best. They know what their constituents need. They know the terrain where they live. They know the cost of providing services. Some places have higher labor market costs, for example, than other places. So oftentimes you'll hear these leaders say, if Washington would just get out of the way, just give us the money. And by the way, that's happened since time immemorial as well. As early as 1947, I found a case of a bunch of governors going to Washington to tell President Eisenhower, please, loosen those purse strings. We know best what to do with the money. So that's a constant tension between federal and state and local governments. But another reason for federal grants is that grants can smooth local spillovers, or either good or bad things that local governments do that transcend their borders. So you could imagine we might want to incentivize state and local governments to do things like provide more education, because education has benefits to everyone if we have an educated workforce, well-trained workforce. Similarly, we might want to penalize or disincentivize state and local governments from doing certain things like releasing toxic substances into the environment. So we can do that through a system of grants operated by higher levels of government. So in the case of school districts, for example, states might give them money to do certain things. And in the case of states and local governments, the federal government might step in. So what do I mean by fiscal disparities? Well, places differ in terms of the amount of revenue they can raise, just given the tax base that they start with. So this table that I'm showing you applies a method called the representative revenue system to a bunch of states, and I've picked a couple of states, including Nevada, to illustrate sort of different measures of capacity. So what this does is basically take nationally representative tax rates. If we just applied the average for the whole country to a state as it stands, to its tax base, what would it raise in revenue? So I forgot to ask if I have a pointer here. Let's see. Oh, I do. So if Nevada applied nationally representative taxes to its tax base, it would raise about $6,000 per capita, which would make it about 9th in terms of its revenue capacity. Nevada actually raises about $5,000 per capita, which means that its actual revenues as a share of capacity are less than 100%, which makes it 48th off. So there are two things going on here. One is its revenue capacity, and the other is its revenue effort. In either case, people at a higher level of government, at the federal level, might have a concern if that means that Nevada is spending less on things that we care about, that we think are good and important for all people to lead a meritorious life, things like education, healthcare, and so forth. So another way of thinking about capacity is to look at spending, at the spending side of the ledger. So similarly to applying national average tax rates, you could apply national average spending levels to measures of need in the state. And this would be things like the share of the low-income population, or looking at rates of poverty and low-income kids, also the labor costs of an area. So based on Nevada's spending need and nationally average representative rates, the state should be spending about $7,000 per capita, which would place it at about 9th in the country. The state actually does spend closer to $6,000, which means that it's spending less as a share of its need by this method. And I should say this is also data for 2005. I'm just trying to give you a sense of how we think about disparities. And that places the state at 39th. So now what some researchers do, and I'm going to spare you this here because it's already a complicated table, is combine these two things, revenue capacity and spending need, into a measure of overall fiscal capacity. And then the argument is that federal grants should smooth these differences in capacity so that no matter where a child is born, for example, they have the same access to education and other types of public services. So that's the argument for federal grants, that they smooth disparities in fiscal capacity as well as taking care of these spillovers that I mentioned. Now, once we sort of accept that there are federal grants, there can be any type of federal grants. The major types are block grants, which allow some discretion to the recipient to allocate funds according to how they see fit. I should say, actually, one type that's not on here, because we don't really do this in this country, is just completely unrestricted grants. So all of these are restricted in some way. Other countries that are organized as federations, like Canada, Switzerland, they do provide just unrestricted assistance to their governors or leaders of provinces and of municipalities to direct in the way that they think is most appropriate. We used to do that in this country. The General Revenue Sharing Program did that. That program was terminated in 1986. The argument was that there were, quote unquote, no more revenues left to share, but it was really never very popular because of this tension I mentioned earlier. Federal policymakers felt like they were doing all the heavy lifting in terms of raising revenue, and then all these guys at the local level got to go to ribbon cutting ceremonies and that sort of thing. So it's kind of a hard thing to argue for politically. So we do, federal dollars do come with strings attached in this country, but the strings can differ according to the type of grant. So one type of grant, as I mentioned, is a block grant. So this would be like temporary assistance to needy families, or TANF. As long as you're satisfying certain objectives of trying to move people from welfare to work, you can allocate those funds basically according to the way that you see fit. So towards childcare or job training or cash assistance. Other types of funds have more strings attached, and depending on how narrow those restrictions are, we might call it categorical. The funds can only go for a very specific category of spending, a very specific purpose. And then also you might have funds that are restricted to a specific project that you've applied for. So by talking about applying for funds, I've already gotten into the next category, which is whether a fund, whether a grant is based on a formula, which might include things like income levels, or the share of kids in an area, or the share of elderly, or things like revenue effort, which I showed you earlier. So the General Revenue Sharing Program tried to kind of provide incentives for people to raise their own taxes, and so that was part of the formula. It was a very convoluted formula that tried to simultaneously equalize differences in capacity and reward effort. So in some sense, it's not surprising that program was kind of collapsed under the weight of its conflicting expectations. But in addition to formulas, we can have competitions, and those actually have been on the rise, especially with the 2009 Recovery Act. There were some pots of money in there, as you probably heard about the Race to the Top funds, where states had to show that they were ready to make certain education reforms in order to even qualify for the competition. And the federal government was able to leverage a very small amount of money, really about $5 billion, and get these major reforms because states really needed the money. Other types of competitive awards in the stimulus were Tiger grants for transportation. And actually, the president's pre-K proposal is kind of continuing this tradition of sort of giving grants but requiring some reforms along those lines. So in addition to these distinctions I've talked about, grants can come with strings attached in terms of matching requirements. So if a state gets money, it has to spend some of its own resources in order to continue qualifying for funds. I'll show you some information on that with regard to Medicaid in a little bit. In addition, federal funds can come with maintenance of effort requirements. So here the idea is that you want to prevent the recipient from basically taking the federal funds and then substituting those monies for its own funds, redirecting its own funds elsewhere. You're trying to increase overall spending in an area. Okay, so beyond federal grants, there are other ways the federal government can spend money in an area. They have their own retirement and disability programs for their employees. They have Social Security payments, veterans benefits. The federal government also makes other direct payments to individuals. This would be for things like Medicare, unemployment insurance, earned income tax credits, food stamps, farm subsidies, rental subsidies for Section 8. The federal government buys stuff, so especially in the region where I live, procurement is a very big deal in Virginia, Maryland, and those economies. They might enter into leases for real estate. The federal government pays salaries and wages to current employees as well as retirement benefits to former employees. So all these types of federal spending go into an economy and themselves constitute a type of transfer to local economies. So where does Nevada fit in all of this? Well, as you may have seen, and probably why you're here tonight in the pouring rain, is Nevada ranks last. So Nevada ranks last in total federal spending. This is including all those categories like procurement and retirement and disability payments that I showed you earlier. And this is for fiscal year 2010. Just as a side note, as a data geek, I have to say these data are not exactly available any longer, which is why I'm looking to 2010. You can still find some of this online, but it's a lot harder. The website is usaspending.gov, but the main report, Consolidated Federal Funds Report, that I'm relying on was wiped out because of federal budget cuts. So that's the kind of environment that we're in right now in Washington. So Nevada ranks last in terms of total federal spending per capita, about $7,000 per capita. And here you can see how it ranks with respect to other states and also its neighbors. Actually, I have another slide on that. So compared to other Western states that you think might share certain characteristics in terms of federally owned land or procurement and wages and salaries, it still is at the bottom. And these other states that are in the same region don't seem to face that kind of problem. So looking specifically at grants, again, Nevada is not at the bottom, but near the bottom, at least in 2010. And I should say here, these are grants, I'm sorry, the resolution is so poor on these. These are grants not just to state and local governments, but to nonprofits, Native American tribes, that sort of thing. So this is about $3.7 billion in 2010. This is looking just at grants to state and local governments. So this is about $2.8 billion. But I'm sorry, and actually this is just the state. This is not state and local. But you can see basically that when you have a system, so on average, the average state gets about 30% or more than 30% of its revenue from the federal government. In Nevada, that proportion is less, about 27%, and that means the proportion that comes from other sources like taxes is greater. So there are trade-offs. Now, oftentimes you'll see these comparisons that look at federal spending net of taxes, so how much the state sends to the federal government versus how much it gets back. And then you see this breakdown of sort of donor states versus recipient states. And my home state of California, I remember the governor during one of the budget crises there went to Washington to say, we're tired of being a donor state. These comparisons are tricky because they change from year to year. So this is actually from The Economist magazine looking over 10 years. Other comparisons will be in a given year, and sometimes they also look at not necessarily federal tax collections, state tax payments, but or tax collections, but they try to sort of allocate the burden of the federal debt by state. And so that gets a little complicated, which is why here I'm just looking at money sent in and money coming out. But in any case, you see that, so here being at the top of the list is not good. It means that you are a donor state. And so Nevada is near the top, but actually I should take back a little bit the not good. What people would say in response to Governor Schwarzenegger when he was going to Washington was that, you know, being at the top of the list also means that you're higher income and a lot of things that you don't necessarily want to trade. So this is sort of the way of the world in a federalist system there, or in Europe, for example, right now, they're always going to be donor and recipient states. But if it's something that's consistent, and especially this issue with grants, it might be something that you want to look at. Okay, so why is Nevada at the bottom when it comes to federal grants per capita? Well, in general, this is a framework that I developed in a report with some co-authors in California a couple of years ago. But I think it's helpful for looking at any area of spending, whether it's a particular function, as I'll get into in a little bit, or no matter what the revenue source. So for any area of spending, you often see these comparisons of spending per capita by state, or rankings of spending per capita by state. But spending per capita always is a function of how many caseloads, or what the workload is for a public program, per capita or per your state population, and then how much you spend per person who's getting that service. So you could think of this framework being applied to something like a social services program, like job training, how many people are enrolled in the program and how much are you spending per enrollee. But you could also use this to understand things like transportation. How many lane miles do you have that you have to pay for, and how much are you spending per lane mile? And then within each of those categories, you could think of caseloads or workloads being a combination of demographics or the potentially eligible population for that program in your state, so your low-income population or your young population or your elderly population, and then what policy choices you make in terms of who's eligible for the program among that potential eligible group. And then how many people in that potentially eligible group actually take up the benefits that you've made them eligible for. So in terms of the title of this, by choice or by chance, you could think of something like demographics as being largely beyond the control of policymakers, at least in the short term. Some people argue that people move in response to things like tax rates or other public policies, regulation. But that happens over time. There's actually not a ton of evidence that people are very responsive to tax rates. They care about the whole picture. They care about what services they're getting and that sort of thing. But again, that takes time. In the short term, you can think of demographics as being sort of what you're given, your endowment that you start with, and then you make choices about what you're going to do with what you're given, where you start. And then on the spending side, in the same way, you can think about the level of service that you choose to provide. What's the quality of the lane miles of freeway that you're providing? And that's usually a function of labor, or how many people, for example, are working for the highway administration, and then how much you're paying each of those people. Or maybe in something that's more traditionally labor intensive, you could think of teachers, staffing ratios, number of teachers per student, and how much you pay each teacher. So you can always break down spending into these categories. Well, similarly, I think this helps us understand a little bit more about federal spending. The great majority of federal spending is actually formula-based, determined by these often convoluted programs like I was describing, like general revenue sharing, or Medicaid, where the formula is based on per capita personal income, and it's basically a sliding scale, so that if you're lower income, you get a higher federal match rate. So only about, 85% are formula-based. A very small percentage are actually awarded by competitions or for projects. So to understand these formulas, and again, this is why it might be not the best thing in the world to be a recipient state, whether you come out ahead or behind in terms of taxes paid versus spending received depends on things like your demographics, or the share of elderly living in your state that qualify for federal programs, the share of young people who might qualify for other types of federal programs like Title I education grants, and then the economic prosperity of your state. So if you're doing well, if you're raising a lot of money in terms of your taxes, you're going to be a donor state. You're economically healthy. But it also depends on things like industry mix. If you have a large federal presence in your state, you're going to get more federal dollars. If you have a large agriculture industry, you might have more people qualifying for those types of benefits. I already mentioned military bases and research labs, and then also unforeseen events. So say that there's a natural disaster, more money flows into an area, or a human disaster like severe unemployment, federal grants go up. Okay, so going back to my little framework here and applying it to Medicaid. So this is looking at all Medicaid spending, state and federal, but this also might be a ranking that you're familiar with. Nevada's at the bottom when it comes to total Medicaid spending per capita per state resident. And now that's a function of how many people are in Medicaid per state resident, and actually Medicaid's participation rate is low, about 12% of the population, which makes it 48th. And then the spending per person who's enrolled per case is also low, at about $4,000 per case. But remember, I said beneficiaries are driven by demographics, eligibility rules, and take-up rates. So demographics is basically what you start with. Eligibility rules is a function of federal and state policy decisions. And then take-up rates are basically individual and family choices about whether to apply, and also the results of an administrative process about whether that actually happens, whether you actually get on the rolls or not. And then spending per beneficiary, for many areas of spending, is a function of staffing ratios and labor costs. In Medicaid, the payments actually go to outside vendors, private healthcare providers. So you could think of it as more being sort of the intensity of healthcare services that people receive, but also what they're eligible for due to policy choices made at the federal and the state level. So I'll talk about each of those in turn. So again, this is sort of the good news in terms of getting less federal money. Nevada has lower poverty compared to a lot of other states. It's in this second to last here. So a lot of states that have high incomes also have high poverty rates, or high proportions of people that qualify for federal assistance. But Nevada is not among the worst off in terms of especially some of these southern states. So because it has a low poverty rate, Nevada also has a low matching rate from the federal government for Medicaid because of the sliding scale that I mentioned. So it's not among the lowest states down here in terms of how much money they draw from the federal government. So the range is about 47 to 73 cents per state dollar in terms of the federal match. Nevada is not towards the top, it's towards the sort of middle of that distribution. Nevada also has, there's not a lot of variation in these maps, I'm sorry. So Nevada also has a relatively high proportion of young people living in the state compared to some other states, say like Florida. But then it's sort of in the middle tier in terms of the population age 65 and over. But it's not, again, among the very high group of states like Florida and a couple of other sort of northeastern states. So because of these demographics, much like my home state of California, the population that is enrolled in Medicaid is actually cheaper to care for, to treat. So these graphs focus on the dual eligible population, the population that's eligible for both Medicaid and Medicare, which is the nation's main program for providing medical assistance to the elderly, whereas Medicaid is for primarily people who are economically disadvantaged, but also the medically needy or elderly that basically use up their long-term care benefits through Medicare and become eligible for Medicaid. So these enrollees, these dual eligibles, constitute a pretty small proportion of total enrollments, but a pretty big proportion of Medicaid spending. And you can slice this pie in different ways too, in terms of major eligibility groups like elderly and disabled versus adults, non-elderly, and kids and families. And when you do it that way, it's about a third of the enrollees are elderly and disabled, but they account for actually more than 2/3 of the cost because these are more intensive services that are being provided. So in a sense, Nevada gets kind of a demographic boon. It has a younger population. It doesn't have among the lowest poverty rates. So it's getting to treat people who are less expensive, and it doesn't get a huge federal matching rate for that reason. But beyond those kind of things that are given in terms of the poverty rate and the age range of the population here, Nevada's made some choices. So there are basically, in order to qualify for federal funds under Medicaid, you have to provide benefits to certain mandatory groups. Beyond those mandatory benefits, you can extend eligibility to other groups. And this is the crux of the issue with the Affordable Care Act, that now all states were supposed to have to provide Medicaid up to 133% of the federal poverty line. The Supreme Court ruled that that was optional last summer, and then there's this question of whether governors are going to participate. Your governor has said that he will. But prior to the Affordable Care Act, some states just decided they were going to cover these people. So New York was a particularly generous state. Working parents were covered up to 150% of the federal poverty line. Adults without dependent children, this is the new group that's going to be eligible under the Medicaid expansions. New York was already covering them up to 100% of the federal poverty line. So you can see that the average state was taking advantage of some of these optional increases. Pregnant women is another popular one. Nevada wasn't necessarily doing that. So it was, and I should say also, not all of these groups receive full benefits. Pregnant women, for example, sometimes it's limited to just prenatal care. But when given the choice, Nevada wasn't necessarily choosing to extend more generous benefits than it had to under federal law. Wasn't choosing to extend benefits to more people than it had to under federal law. So similarly, that's the eligibility side, excuse me. On the enrollment side, there are certain mandatory services that you have to provide in order to get any federal funds. And then there's certain optional services that you can choose to provide, home health visits, that sort of thing. So on that dimension also, the national split is about 60% optional, 40% mandatory services. In Nevada, it's about 48% optional, 52% mandatory services. So these are policy choices that the state has made. It's not always the same as other choices that other states have made. And basically, when you have fewer optional eligibility groups, fewer optional benefits that you're providing, that means that you're drawing fewer federal dollars, whatever your federal matching rate is. And as I've said, Nevada is not among the lowest income states, and so its federal matching rate is not among the highest for all states. Okay, so that was the Medicaid story. Other factors actually work in Nevada's favor. Nevada has among the highest, or the highest percentage of federally owned land. This means that actually, whereas Nevada doesn't do very well on health and human services, which is the bulk of grant dollars that go to states, as I said earlier, and the bulk that Nevada gets, notwithstanding that it might be able to do better, it does pretty well on grants from, say, the Department of Interior because of these publicly owned lands and things like royalties for mining and that sort of thing. Also, in a crisis, it kind of helps to go through something horrible, as you guys did. So Nevada had the highest unemployment rate in the country during the recession, 14%. This is an old graph, so current is not current any longer. I think this is from several months ago. So Nevada, but the point is, I just wanted to show that Nevada was hit harder than other states in the recession, and that meant that it did very well under the Recovery Act. And I'm sorry this is so difficult to see, but what I do is I look at, this really came out poorly, I'm sorry. Nevada got a sizable chunk of money from the Recovery Act in terms of funds that were pretty much discretionary, that governors could choose how to spend as they wanted, and funds that went to the state but not necessarily for the state to keep but to distribute to other people. And in this table I basically show that net of what the state would have spent in terms of taxes, Nevada actually did pretty well under the Recovery Act. And that makes sense because the Recovery Act had a lot of funds that were directed to places that had endured especially high unemployment, not just in terms of higher unemployment benefits, but even Medicaid matching rates were adjusted upwards for places that experienced large swings in unemployment. So Nevada benefited from that, and it was among the states that did better net of what it would have paid in terms of taxes for those same benefits. So what's left for the state to do? Well, I'm not expecting to go through this whole slide, but this is from a Government Accountability Office report, just to make the point that grants can be complicated. They involve many stages of management and application. The application process, I should say, as a researcher that applies for grants, can be very time-consuming and can involve many stages. And so it requires active management during the pre-award stage, the award stage, the implementation stage, and then very importantly at the end, there's often an evaluation that's required that involves some data collection and reporting. And this actually increased with the Recovery Act. The Recovery Act was all about information collection and reporting. Some of you might have seen the website recovery.gov, where you can look up, what each jurisdiction spent almost in real time. So that reporting can be a little bit more difficult when you've got a state with complicated political institutions. Here are just a couple of things about Nevada. Not on here is the fact that you guys have a part-time legislature that meets biennially for 4 months out of the year, but also, and it's not uncommon to have split control of the state government, but a Republican governor, Democratic state legislator, an initiative process, although it's a weaker initiative than in other states like California. And so that can make sort of grant administration or even deciding to apply for a grant a little bit more difficult. Also, when you're talking about grants from local governments, or sorry, to local governments from the federal government, it matters sort of how much fiscal autonomy local governments have. So this is a map that looks at whether local governments are restrained by tax limitations, which could be imposed at the state level or at the local level, and whether they have access to revenue sources beyond the property tax. So this is a scale that one of my colleagues, Mike Pagano, came up with, but you can see that Nevada's in the last category, which he calls straitjacket, which basically means that, that you don't have a lot of autonomy at the local level. A lot of decisions have to go through the state in terms of revenue sources that you have access to, and fewer revenue sources are available at this time. And so that's just an indicator of perhaps how much autonomy local governments have when they're going after grants. So there's some positive steps. Governor Sandoval has said that he will participate in the Affordable Care Act expansion. That means you're going to get more money from the federal government for Medicaid. The match rate is 100% for that, just that expansion population for the next couple of years, and it declines to 90% thereafter, supposedly in perpetuity, but a lot of governors were uneasy that it might be changed after that, and that's part of this continual tension between levels of government. In addition, there's an Office of Grant Procurement, Coordination, and Management that was established in the summer of 2011, and they do reporting on their success rates in terms of getting grants, and they report that they're actually doing a lot better. So measurement sometimes makes a difference, and now that it's being measured and now being focused on, they're reporting a hit rate of about 85%, which as someone who applies for grants, I think is pretty good. So, the relationship between the federal government and states and localities generally is going to be rocky going ahead. And that's basically because the federal government has its ongoing focus on deficit reduction, regardless of the fights coming up in terms of having a budget after September 30th and fights about the debt limit and whether each additional increase in the debt limit requires a decrease in spending. The federal government is facing the same pressures as states and localities in terms of aging populations, rising healthcare costs, and at the state and local level you also have these pension costs. So especially Medicaid. If you think about it, it's about $400 billion at all levels of government. There's no way that that program's not going to change in the years ahead. So in the short term, there are going to be continual pressures on this murky category of non-defense discretionary spending. This is the part that was subject to the sequester. It's going to result in about a 5% cut for particular types of grants for states. So the big ticket items like Medicaid and TANF that I talked about are off the table, but this affects little things like some education funding, community development block grants, low-income heating assistance. The problem with this category is that because it includes all these little programs, there's no constituency holding a banner for non-defense discretionary spending, as, for example, there is with defense spending. And so it's likely to get cut no matter what the outcome of some of these fights in Washington right now. And then, as I said, there are sort of these long-term projections that federal debt is projected to in the long term, not in the short. The short-term picture looks a lot better, actually, over the next 10 years. But going forward, we have projections of debt reaching up to 100% of GDP. States and localities also, there aren't as many long-term projections available. Only the Government Accountability Office really does it, but they show a gap of about 4% of GDP between money coming in and money going out by 2060 as a result of these same pressures that I mentioned at the federal level: aging populations, rising healthcare costs. So at the federal level, as I mentioned, there are proposals to restructure Medicaid, to maybe block grant it. At the same time, states are seeing Medicaid now becoming their largest budget category, larger than K-12 education when you consider spending from all funds, from federal funds too. And actually, one thing that you hear about a lot more is on the tax side. There's talk of limiting, if not eliminating, but probably much more likely limiting the exemption of municipal bond interest from federal taxation. So right now, if you hold a corporate bond, you pay taxation on those earnings as interest payments that you get as a bondholder. If you owe a bond from the state of Nevada, you don't pay taxes on that at the federal level, and probably not at the state level either. States usually exempt their own bonds, but they don't have to exempt bonds from other states from interest payments. So the federal government is talking about cutting back on that, as well as the deductibility of state and local taxes. Here it would be sales taxes, but in other states it's income and property taxes, in order to balance its own budget. So there are pressures ahead. Governors are very wary, especially after the fiscal cliff debate last year, where it was very hard to put together a budget because governors didn't even know if there's going to be a federal estate tax the next year or what the federal capital gains tax was going to look like. So revenue estimating has gotten a lot more difficult because of federal policy, as well as changes in the economy, like earnings becoming a lot more volatile. Okay, so the best thing that state and local governments can do is be ready. I do think if there's a silver lining from the Great Recession, it's that there's been a lot more focus on defining what core services are. And sometimes you've seen, if not outright government consolidations, entering into shared service arrangements or financing and trying to figure out where you could do things more efficiently. And oftentimes I've seen these more productive conversations about trade-offs, the idea that trade-offs exist. As an economist, I'm very sympathetic to that point of view. And something that's been kind of the holy grail among public budget practitioners for a long time, which is participatory budgeting. So having a gathering like we're doing right now, talking about what the trade-offs are, and elected officials basically asking their constituents, what would you like to do? This is the money that we have available, and these are the choices that we have. So I think that continuing with the lessons learned from the Great Recession and in this positive direction is really the best way to be ready for anything that comes out of Washington. And that's all I have prepared. So I'm happy to hear from you guys. Yes?
I think there has been some effort, I think, in the present administration and even with Senator Reid, to do some things about making energy more clean, improving, getting the EPA going. There's been some things in the energy area in terms of that part of it. But the flip side of that, and I know there's a lot of things there that impact regulation, and now I know that our utility's getting swallowed up by a bigger utility.
We need you to ask the question.
The question basically is, do you see that there is, do you think there would be anything in the way of energy production, or and in terms of being able then to be able to sell that, not just use it locally or do regional or something like that? What do you?
Energy production as a way of raising revenue in the state, or?
Raising revenue and economic activity, both. Yeah.
I see.
Raising revenue through the economic activity.
Well, it sort of depends what type of energy. So another project I'm working on with another Brookings Mountain West scholar, Adele Moros, who will be here in a couple of weeks, is the idea of a state carbon tax. So this paper is very much under development, but the concern is that lots of types of energy results in externalities, right, to the environment, and those are not necessarily priced in. So if we were to try to price those appropriately, might that be a way of both containing emissions that are harmful to the environment, but also raising revenue that could then allow you to get rid of revenue sources that are more harmful to economic growth. So in particular, a lot of people are concerned about things like corporate income taxes at the state level. They're very hard to assess at the state level for the same reason they're hard at the national level. You hear these stories about companies shifting profits all over the world and establishing headquarters in Ireland and that sort of thing. That happens at the state level as well. There are armies of consultants who help with that. That's inefficient. It's a waste of resources to have so much go into basically trying to figure out how to minimize your tax bill, and it also increases enforcement costs for state governments. Also, I have to say, the state corporate income tax bothers me because whenever it starts to grow, you've seen sort of massive increases and then declines in corporate profits. The corporate income tax never grows because the incentive is always to give away the base through tax credits or exemptions. So it's just an inefficient tax all around. Maybe there's room to do something about that tax if we have a state carbon tax, which a lot of people would say is more efficient. I don't want to give too much away about our paper, but then there are also issues with the state carbon tax that we're going to have to point out, that doing it at the state level doesn't necessarily address externalities and in fact creates some with regard to other states. So are there avenues to maybe harmonize activities across states? That's something that Adele will be talking about. Yep.
We're exempt to that entire argument. We don't have a state income tax.
Right, I know, right. But we're looking at other states in the region as well. Yeah, you don't have personal or corporate income taxes yet. Yeah, yes.
I guess I'm looking for a little more direction for what we can do at the state level, particularly in the health area. If you had, if you were going to sit down with Mike Wilden from HHS and Jackie Bryant from the governor's office and tell them you got $10 million extra, how can you use this to leverage additional funds from the federal government? What would you recommend?
Well, what other states have done, and I can't recommend this necessarily because in some cases I think it's resulted in sort of too much taking from the federal government, right? So I don't know what the optimal amount of federal grants is for any particular state. I could see why Nevadans would be concerned about being at the bottom of all those rankings. But what other states have done is to increase their spending on Medicaid. And once you increase some of your own spending, then you draw down more funds from the federal government, right? So the state is near the bottom when it comes to voluntary decisions to expand eligibility and benefits. If it were to cover more people, it would get more federal dollars. So that's the sort of, Medicaid is the big kahuna when it comes to health and human services. I'm not aware of other little pots of money, but those are certainly worth looking at as well. Yes?
Bringing home the bacon is a measure of political success. It was an issue in the latest senatorial race of Senator Reid. And the argument made by defecting Republicans, Sig Rogich and Jim Murin of Mandalay Bay, was don't be stupid and elect somebody that doesn't have any seniority. They'll bring home the bacon. I've listened to your talk. Can you help me address such arguments with better critical thinking? Because it has an intuitive sense to it. But what you showed me is, here, I'm not so sure politicians can bring home the bacon. 85% of what happens comes through by formulas. So how do we judge that argument?
Well, for one thing, you could try to change the formulas. And that's something that definitely goes on. So there's a lot of research that shows that there's basically collusion. It's maybe a strong word, but potential. So economists have long found that. So the theory is that when you get $1 of federal revenue, it should be like any other dollar. And so one thing you might want to do is cut taxes. That never happens. So why does that never happen? Economists call it the Flypaper Effect, that money sticks where it hits. One explanation for that is that you basically have a tacit agreement where people who are going to get the funds say, if you give us the funds, we'll keep spending in this area, or we're gonna spend the money with the way that you want us to. And by the way, this is a huge issue with the stimulus, right? There are some people who say that states just pocketed the money, they didn't get it out the door, they didn't spend it quickly enough. I would argue that they actually did over a longer time frame, and to the extent that they didn't, that's kind of typical behavior. That's what individuals did with their tax rebates as well. But getting to your question, so there is evidence that awardees do have some input, and that makes sense, right? People who are representing them might want to know what they think about funding formulas, what are good funding formulas, what are bad funding formulas. So it pays to get educated about what you would like to see in a funding formula. But then beyond that, there are these project awards, which are a small portion of the pie, but every little bit counts. And basically, you can't get something that you haven't applied for. So putting your hat in the ring is always important. And that might be something that the Office of Grants and Procurement is going to be looking at, is trying to be more aware of these deadlines as they come up and go after these funds. So I've heard stories about pots of money here and there that Nevada might not have gone for, certain higher education funds, and so it's hard to always stay on top of that stuff, but that's a state issue more than a federal issue. At the federal level, there are always ways that the delegation can work together. It's not just based on one person, even if that one person, and by the way, the literature does show that it should follow seniority and rank. So that certainly helps, but it's not the only thing that matters. Did you have a question? Yeah.
Yeah, my comment is the inverse of his. What your talk reminds me of is a mother that teaches her children to get on welfare,
right,
rather than go learn a job and learn to do things, or a father, a mafioso father that teaches his kids how to extort money from businesses. The federal government is in horrible shape. We're $17 trillion in debt now, worse than any other country other than Japan or a couple others like that. And it's getting worse. There's no way, and here you are coming to a university talking to students who are going to be earning less than we're earning today and have to pay back all this money. It's a totally untenable thing.
Right.
We're in essence counterfeiting $1 trillion a year through this program of the Federal Reserve, and then we're borrowing we're causing the people of China to work harder so we can borrow money from them. I mean, they work 14-hour days, so we can borrow.
Yeah, so I see where you're headed, and this is why I said I don't know what the optimal amount of federal grants is for a state, and I'm not here to say you need to maximize your money from the federal government. But what I am saying is that I can see why people from Nevada would be concerned about consistently being at the bottom, and this is how federal grants work. And if you wanted to get more money from the federal government, this is how you could do it. And by the way, the federal government is making these streams of money available because states are doing something that federal policymakers want, right? So it's not a bailout. It's not, there's a quid pro quo going on here. The federal government has decided they have an interest in covering certain people with health care, for example. The way to do that is to give money to states. So you don't get the money unless you perform the service, right? So I take issue with people in Washington who say things like the states are insolvent, they can't even balance their budgets without 30 cents on the dollar from the federal government. That's not a gift, that's a payment for services rendered where the federal government has decided that state and local policymakers are better at performing those services like education, which the federal government really has no business doing except setting standards and certain accountability mechanisms. So, we can argue about the right total size of government, federal, state, and local, but in terms of and the right amount of federal grants for a state, but I wouldn't say that it's free money. In the same way that you're arguing that quantitative easing is not free money. Things come with a price.
That's right. We're going to pay the price in the future.
Well,
that's why the founders of the Constitution, the developers of the Constitution, forbid direct taxation because it's the direct taxation that permits all this insanity.
Well, I don't think we're getting rid of the federal income tax, though. So, I think, but
and it's going to continue until finally we collapse.
Well, but I do think that there are arguments for devolution. There are arguments for state and local leaders doing things that the federal government can't do. And the way that the federal government gets them to do that is by providing the money, right? And that's what we've seen with the Affordable Care Act expansion, that these are populations that were otherwise uninsured, and now they're going to be insured. And in fact, there's evidence that it's bringing down healthcare costs overall because it's part of a package that also is requiring more hospital accountability and that sort of thing. So I want to get some new people into this. How about you?
You said in your talk that the demographics of a state doesn't really shift in response to policy, and I'm wondering, does that apply to business? Because the low tax rate is the primary pitch for business for this state.
Right.
Do you think that's effective?
Right, I think it's a good question. So basically, I was thinking more about individuals, and there is, some evidence that very wealthy individuals, I mean, certainly, it depends sort of on your level of aggregation. So, for example, the city of New York, watches like a hawk certain people at certain income levels to make sure that they're not spending more than 183 days a year in the city, because if they do, then they're subject to the city income tax. So it's certainly true if those individuals were to leave, that would be a real loss for the city. But in general, high-income individuals don't respond. High-income individuals respond, but individuals, themselves at other income levels are more motivated by things like access to jobs and family and that sort of thing. Businesses, same sort of thing. If you ask CEOs what's important, they'll mention taxes among other variables like regulation, the cost of regulation on them as business leaders, and also the value of the services they're getting, right? So you don't really want to do business in a place that has terrible roads, but roads cost money. They require taxes. So most of the literature shows that taxes are sort of one variable that goes into businesses' decisions about where to locate. But it's not the only variable. But certainly, any business person is going to talk about costs on an after-tax basis, not on a pre-tax basis. So it's there. It's always there. The silver lining of that is that you also have business people who are engaged in public policy, who want to have a say when it comes to things like infrastructure. So I hope that answers your question. Yes?
Yes, I was wondering, why do you think Nevada is last in federal funding? I've heard the argument that Nevada's last because either we're not applying for federal grants, or that the grants are so poorly written that they're not even being looked at. Do you think it's by choice that we're not applying for these grants, or is it by chance that we have really bad luck, or that we're so straitjacketed? What is your argument?
So the class of grants, the first thing that's important to point out is the class of grants that you're talking about are these competitive awards, or they're project-based, and that's just a small portion of the pie. So the kind of by chance part is the sort of formula-based stuff, and that's kind of where you have to start with what you've got. Other than sort of trying to have some influence into the funding formulas, which some states do. In terms of the quality of the submissions, that's not something that I've looked at, but that's something that I heard a lot about, not specific to Nevada, but when I was doing my research about the Recovery Act, one person in one agency said that was really an issue. So they were trying to get funds at the door very, very quickly, and they basically had to task federal employees with helping local grant applicants, get their grants in good enough shape to get them across the finish line. So local capacity can be a real issue. I don't know specifically about Nevada, although it's certainly a positive step that there is this office that's been formed that does annual reports, or actually might be biannual reports, where you can check on progress. And so, that visibility is also important. But, I think key to your question is remembering that these project-based awards are a small portion of the total pie. Yes, you had a question.
I'll keep mine quick. So if I understand this correctly, and I'm actually going to be asking for kind of a synopsis, if Nevada were to modify its formulas and increase the benefits and the people that it was covering through Medicaid, or is it Medicaid?
Yeah.
The younger one, through Medicaid, then in effect we would not only be providing better health care for the poor and needy and underrepresented in our state, but would also be getting more of our own money back from our federal government.
Because Nevada contributes more in taxes, yes, you'd be getting more money back from the federal government. You would be less of a donor state, and that's also going to improve just by virtue of the ACA expansion. And then Health and Human Services is sort of just one area. There may be other areas where that's possible. These matching rates are not just in Medicaid, but other areas as well. But key to this decision is also the idea that you're still on the hook for providing part of that dollar. And is it worth it to you in order to cover that person? Is that something that's still a good policy goal? You don't want to just, provide this service to draw down federal funds. It still has to have some value to, the community. I hope that makes sense. Yes.
All right, thank you very much for your presentation. Much appreciated. Randy Innes, International Trade and Business Center. You've noticed that we're going through, obviously, a shifting of the paradigm from the gaming industry into other clusters and other industry clusters. My question is, if you were a part of our community and you were going to put together a strike force of taking the public-private alliance and putting an initiative forward about who should be on a strike force to go after these matching grants that would pair up with investor money. Let's consider EB5 money, for example, just an example, or some money from California that comes to build a project here. What would you go through, or how would you begin to put together a team to get these matching grants?
Right. So, I think that's what the Office of Procurement is. That's their mission. That's the reason that they were created. But I think that, personally, I'm a favor in sort of enlisting more local governments in some of these decisions as well, because they have certain, capacity that they bring in terms of knowing their populations and their needs, and so sort of more state and local cooperation, as well as input from the private sector in terms of what they need for infrastructure and that sort of thing. But there's also the danger of sort of having too big of a strike force and too many sort of chefs in the kitchen. And so I think you need to make sure that you're sort of giving the people who are experts in sort of grant writing room to do their job. And it seems like the task of this office at the state level, is starting down that road, but having more input from folks in the private sector, as you say, and from my perspective, more people at the local level, I think would be a good thing.
Yeah, we go through the process about every 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then we come out with a statement of work, we come out with appendices of where the money is to
Right.
go after it, put it on the shelf, we all
Right.
go to sleep, and then wake up 10 years later and try it again.
Right, and I've seen that with tax reform as well. That always happens, and I actually just had some experience with that in the District of Columbia. It's hard. I speak from experience. It's hard when you spend a lot of time, putting together these great reports with great appendices, and they do just sit on the shelves. But I think every little bit helps, and certainly when it comes with these capacity issues in terms of knowing where the pots of money are, knowing how to go after them, you also have to be able to make your case. And so having more data, having more information at your fingertips is certainly helpful. The states that do well tend to have much more capacity in that area.
So in conclusion, your answer would be the state with the procurement office would be the place to...
I think that's the point of contact, right? That's why they were
Well,
created.
yeah, we've got a point of contact, and obviously is to get them up on their feet and running and operating and accountable and delivering on time, et cetera.
Exactly.
Okay.
Would anyone like a last question? Or we can wait. We can follow up afterwards. I'd like to get people out on time since we promised to do that. Thank you, Tracy.
My pleasure.
Thank you for all the great
Thanks
questions.
for coming.
The Q&A period, in spite of your great lecture, is always a real
Yes, best
interesting part. We're going to reconvene in a week, if you can join us, on the 18th. Another colleague from Brookings will be here, Jonathan Rockwell. He's going to give an interesting presentation on the hidden STEM economy. STEM is an acronym for science, technology, engineering, and math, an important topic in Nevada, and the idea that there are many innovative and interesting jobs out there, and what are the exact education requirements for them, what might higher ed and K through 12 do to shift to this changing economy. So if you can join us, and anyone you know who's interested, we'd love to see you. Thanks again for coming.
Thank you. Hi, Vicki. Nice to see you.